My cousin laughed at the table. Meet my fiancé, he's a surgeon. She mocked my scrubs. Then he saw the trauma team pin, went white, stood up and said, Delphine, sit down. Do you know who she is? The scrubs weren't a statement. I want to get that out of the way first, because for 18 months afterward, a version of this circulated in my family, in which I turned up to an engagement dinner in scrubs to make a point. I finished at 1940 and the table was booked for 8 and the restaurant is 11 minutes from the hospital if the lights are with you. I had a jumper in the car and I put it on over the top in the car park and I still had the lanyard on because I always still have the lanyard on. And if you have ever worked in a hospital, you know that the lanyard is not a decision. The lanyard is a growth. Delphine did the introduction standing up with a glass in her hand to a table of 14. And this is my cousin Seth, who as you can see has come straight from the hospital. A little laugh, a hand gesture at the trousers. So we're all very honored. Seth, this is Callan. He's a surgeon. There's a specific weight she put on the word surgeon and everybody at that table heard it. And I want to be fair and say that it was not really about me. It was about her. She had got a surgeon and she was showing him to 14 people. I said congratulations and sat down. And Callan Vesey, who had been half standing to shake my hand, stopped. He was looking at my chest. Not in that way. At the lanyard, at the pin next to my ID. It's a small enamel thing, dark blue, and it means I'm on the trauma team rota. And about 6 people in that restaurant would have known what it was, and one of them was him. I watched him read my name badge. There are 2 names on it. Most people only ever read the top one, which is Sefton Aldwych Moore. The line under it is the one that matters in a hospital, and it says Consultant in Emergency and Trauma Medicine. And under that, in smaller type, it says the name of the hospital, his hospital, the same one. We had never met, which sounds implausible and is completely ordinary. It is an 800-bed trust across 2 sites with about 400 doctors in it, and a trauma consultant and a general surgical registrar can go years without being in the same room while sharing about 9 patients a month. I watched him read the top line, and then the second line, and then the pin, and then the hospital. And I watched his face do something I have seen perhaps 4 times in my career, and all 4 of the others were in relatives' rooms. And then he put both hands on the table and stood the rest of the way up and said, into a table of 14 people holding menus. Delphine, sit down. Do you know who she is? I need to tell you what everybody at that table thought was happening, because it's the version that survived. They thought a surgeon had recognized a very senior doctor and had stood up out of respect. They thought Delphine had just been publicly corrected by her own fiancé for being rude about somebody important. That's what it looked like. That is exactly what it looked like. And it is a very satisfying thing to look at. And if this story ended 4 minutes into that dinner, it would be a good story. My Aunt Meredith actually said later that evening, well, that put her in her place. Here's what was actually happening. Callan Vesey was not standing up out of respect. He had gone the color of the tablecloth. And the reason he had gone the color of the tablecloth is that 18 months earlier, he had been second assistant on a laparotomy on a 24-year-old motorcyclist who died on the table, and I had shared the mortality review into it. He did not know what that review had found. He had spent 18 months not knowing, and had constructed an entire private account of himself out of the not knowing. And then on a Thursday evening in a Greek restaurant, a woman in scrubs sat down opposite him and turned out to be his fiancé's cousin. He was not standing up because I outranked him. He was standing up because he thought I was about to say something. I should explain what a mortality and morbidity review actually is, because most people's idea of it comes from television, and television has it completely wrong. Somebody dies who was not expected to, or dies in a way that raises a question. A panel is convened. Everybody who is in the room comes and describes what happened, in order, without lawyers, without a union rep, without anybody taking a position. The chair's job is to establish what occurred and whether anything in the system produced it. It is not a disciplinary. It is the specific opposite of a disciplinary, and it only works because of that. And here's the thing that nobody outside medicine ever knows, and which is the entire mechanism of this story. The participants are usually not told the outcome, not out of malice. It's a closed process. The report goes to the department and to governance, and there is very often nobody whose actual job it is to go and find the registrar who was second assistant 11 months ago and tell him what the panel concluded. So they find out sideways, or they don't find out at all. I have known this for years. I have said it in meetings. It is, in fact, in a document with my name on it as a recommendation. I had simply never once, in 14 years, sat opposite one of them at a dinner table. My family have thought I'm cold since about 1998. I want to lay that out properly because it's the ground the rest of this stands on. The Moores are loud, genuinely, warmly, exhaustingly loud. Big Sunday things, everybody talking over everybody, my uncle doing the same 4 stories. It's a nice family. I want to say that clearly. There is nothing wrong with my family except one thing, which is that they have never once known what to do with me. I went to medical school at 18, and I have worked every Christmas since 2009 except 2. I don't drink at family things because I'm usually on call after. And when people ask me about work, I say, yeah, busy, because the alternative is describing my Tuesday, and nobody at a christening wants a description of my Tuesday. So over about 25 years that has been assembled by people who love me into Seth thinks she's better than us. I have heard it said out loud twice. Once by Delphine at a wedding, drunk, in 2019. And here's the part that I have only understood in the last 2 years. And it's the thing this whole story is actually about. They're not entirely wrong about the coldness. I am different at family things. I go quiet, I don't drink, I check my phone, I leave early. But it isn't contempt. It's that I spend 50 hours a week in a resuspe being the calmest person in the room on purpose, and you cannot switch that off in a car park in 11 minutes, and by the time I've got to a table with 14 people at it, I am running on the same setting I used to tell somebody their son has died. Nobody in my family has ever connected those two facts. Why would they? I've never told them. There's a specific evening I think about. Christmas 2016. I'd done a day shift and got to my mother's at about 8, and everybody was 3 drinks in, and my uncle was doing the story about the caravan. At 15:40 that afternoon, I had told a woman about my own age that her 11-year-old had not survived, in a room with a box of tissues on a low table, and then I had gone back out and picked up the next one. And at 8 o'clock, I was sitting on a sofa in a paper hat. Somebody asked me if I'd had a busy one, and I said, yeah, busy. That is the entire mechanism of being thought cold by your family. And I want to be precise about it, because it isn't that I can't talk about it. It's that there is no version of describing that afternoon which does not end with 14 people looking at me, and their Christmas being about it, and somebody crying, and my aunt saying, I don't know how you do it. And I don't want to be the reason my family's Christmas is about a dead 11-year-old. So I say, yeah, busy, and I have a glass of water because I'm back on at 6, and I go home early. 25 years of that, 400 times. And what you get at the end of it is a family who have concluded, entirely reasonably, from the available evidence, that you'd rather be somewhere else. The dinner did not recover. Delphine sat down. She actually did sit down, immediately, which tells you something about the voice he used. And then about 90 seconds later, she got up and went to the toilet, and was gone for a while. And when she came back, her makeup had been redone. Callan was charming for the rest of the evening, impeccably. He asked me 2 questions about my department and did not ask a single one about my job. Both questions were about staffing. I noticed at the time and thought nothing of it. Everybody in the NHS talks about staffing. It's the weather. He asked how many consultants we run overnight. He asked later, over-putting, whether we'd sorted the rota thing, which is the sort of vague sentence one doctor says to another and gets a shrug. I said something vague back. He was 18 months into a changed rota and had never been told why, and he was sitting at a table with the woman who chaired the review, trying to find out from the side whether it had anything to do with him. I did not hear it. I heard shop talk from a man being polite at his own engagement dinner. That's the last moment in this entire story where anything could have gone differently, and it went past me while I was eating dolmades. And Delphine got quietly, thoroughly drunk, and then said, at about 10:30, across the table, to me, in front of everybody, you couldn't just let me have it, could you? Which is the sentence my family took home. I have thought about that for 2 years. Because she was not wrong that something had been taken off her. She just had no idea what or by whom, and neither did anybody else, and I was the only person in that restaurant who could have explained it, and I was not permitted to. I said, Delphine, I've said about 9 words all evening. And she said, yeah, you always do. I want to be fair to my cousin, which is difficult and which I have had 2 years to work at. Delphine is 34 and she works in recruitment, and she has been, for as long as I can remember, the loudest person in any room she is in. And I have always read that as confidence, and I was wrong about it for about 20 years. She was 3 when I went to university. By the time she was old enough to know me, I was already the one who wasn't there, the cousin who missed things, who couldn't come to the thing, who was at work. She grew up inside a family narrative about me that was fully formed before she could contribute to it. And here's the part I did not want to look at. When Delphine was 19, she wanted to do nursing. She applied and didn't get in, and she asked me, at a Christmas, in a kitchen once, whether she should try again. And I said something. I don't remember what. I genuinely, honestly do not remember what I said, which is its own indictment, because she does. She brought it up at that wedding in 2019 when she was drunk and told me I'd said something that put her off entirely, and I said I was sure I hadn't meant it like that, and she said, you never do. So when she stood up at that table with a glass in her hand and said, he's a surgeon with that weight on it, she was not being cruel to a stranger. She was showing something to a room that contained me, and then the surgeon she'd brought to show me stood up and told her to sit down. I've thought about that a great deal. Whatever I have lost in the 2 years since, she lost something in that restaurant in about 4 seconds, and she has never known what it actually was either. Callan Vesey requested a meeting with me at the hospital 11 days later, properly, through my secretary with a subject line, at 08:14 on a Tuesday. Request for a brief meeting a previous case. I want to describe those 11 minutes accurately, because on any recording it would sound like nothing. He came to my office. He was in a jacket. He was extremely polite. He said thank you for seeing me. He said he was sorry about the dinner and that Delphine had had a lot on. Then he said, can I ask you about the Ferreter case? And I said, I can't discuss a review with you. And he said, I understand. I just want to know what it found. I said, I'm not able to discuss it. He said, I'm not asking for the document. I'm asking whether my name's in it. I said, I'm not able to discuss it. And he did it again. Different words. Was there a finding against any individual? Was it referred on? Is there anything I should know about? 3 times in 11 minutes, in a completely reasonable voice, with his hands still. And every single time I said the only sentence I am permitted to say, which is, I'm not able to discuss the outcome of a review with a participant. If you have concerns about your own practice, your clinical supervisor is the right route. Now, I need to explain what that sentence is because it destroyed my life for 5 months. It is a protective sentence. Mortality and morbidity review works. The entire architecture only functions because it is a closed process. People tell the truth in that room specifically because it does not leave that room. The second it becomes becomes discoverable, becomes ammunition, becomes something a chair can wave at somebody in a corridor. Everybody starts lying in it and people die. So the sentence exists to protect him. And I said it 3 times in 11 minutes to a frightened 36-year-old man who had come to my office to find out whether he had killed somebody. I know exactly what it sounded like. It sounded like yes. And I knew it sounded like yes while I was saying it. That's the part I have to own. I could see it happening. I watched a man's face across a desk go from tight to gray over 11 minutes while I said a sentence 3 times. And I understood in real time that every repetition was making it worse. And I said it anyway, because it was the only sentence available. There was one moment where I nearly went off script. He said, the 3rd time, and this is verbatim, I wrote it down afterward, Dr. Aldrich Moore, I've got a wedding in April. If there's something coming, I'd rather know now. And I opened my mouth. What I nearly said was, there is nothing coming. 4 words, not a disclosure. It characterizes nothing about the findings, names nobody, quotes no recommendation. Any reasonable person would say it is not a breach. And I did not say it. And here is the exact reason. And I have interrogated it for 2 years, and I still cannot decide whether it was integrity or cowardice. If I say there is nothing coming, then I have told a participant an outcome, not much of one. But the next time I say I'm not able to discuss it to a different registrar in a different office, that registrar will know, because these things travel, because doctors talk, that I say nothing's coming when nothing's coming, which means silence becomes an answer, which means the protection stops protecting. So I said the sentence a 3rd time, and he thanked me for my time, and he shook my hand at the door. His hand was completely dry and completely steady. I noticed that at the time and thought it meant he was fine. I have since worked out that a surgical registrar's hands being steady under pressure is not information about his emotional state. It's the entire job. He started about 3 weeks later, and he was extremely good at it. Not a rumor. Nothing you could ever point at. He is a doctor, and what he did was use the only vocabulary his profession has ever given anybody for dismantling a woman quietly, which is the vocabulary of concern. It went through my family like water finding a crack, because it came from a surgeon. My aunt merited on the phone in the June. Callan says trauma's the hardest one. He says the burnout in it is terrible. My cousin Ridwin, at a barbecue. You do look tired, Seth. He was saying you can't do that job past 40 without it taking something. My mother, in July, carefully, having clearly rehearsed it. Sefton, has anyone at work talked to you about taking a bit of time? Not one word of that is a lie. Trauma is hard. Burnout in it is terrible. I was tired. I'd done a run of nights. He never once said I was unwell. He said the specialty was hard on people, in a tone to my relatives, repeatedly over 5 months, and let them do the assembly. And every single one of them thought they were being kind. That's the thing I could not get out from under. My mother rang me because a doctor had made her worry about her daughter. I tracked it eventually out of professional habit more than anything, because that is what I do. I take a thing that happened and I put it in order and I look for where it entered. 6 remarks over 5 months that I can date from 4 different relatives. Every single one of them arrived within about a week of a family occasion he had been at. Not one of them was made by somebody who had spoken to him alone. They came from group conversations, a barbecue, a christening, a Sunday thing, where he had said something at a table, generally to somebody else, generally about his own specialty or hers, and let it be overheard. The one I have thought about most was at my aunt's in July. Ridwin told me about it afterward, without any idea what he was handing me. Somebody had asked Callan about his work and he'd said something modest, and then said, apparently apropos of nothing, that people don't realize the emergency specialties chew through people, and that the ones who last are usually the ones who've stopped feeling much, and that you have to be careful because they don't know it's happening. And then, Ridwin said, he'd caught himself and said, sorry, that's shop talk, and changed the subject. Sorry, that's shop talk. He never once said my name. 19 years of my family thinking I was cold, sitting there like dry kindling, and a man walked into it and said one true general sentence about a profession, and then apologized for saying it. I have chaired 11 serious incident reviews. I would not have been able to build a cleaner mechanism than that if you gave me a month. By August, my family had a settled account of me and I have never got it back. The account was, Seth has been under a lot for a long time. Seth was odd at Delphine's dinner. Seth is not really coping and won't say so because Seth never says anything. The engagement dinner had been reframed. In the new version, I had turned up in scrubs, been strange with everybody, and made Delphine cry, and Callan, lovely Callan, had handled it beautifully. I found out about the new version from my own mother, who was defending me with it. I tried once in August in her kitchen. I said, ma'am, he is doing this on purpose. And my mother said, why on earth would he? And I could not answer that question. That is the whole thing. There is no version of the answer that does not require me to describe a closed review process to a 72-year-old woman in a kitchen. And the moment I start doing that, I am a woman explaining an elaborate reason why a nice young doctor is out to get her. I said, I can't tell you. And my mother, who loves me, said very gently, do you hear how that sounds, love? I did. I did hear how it sounded. I'd been hearing how it sounded for 4 months. Then in September, he took it into the hospital, and that is when it stopped being a family problem. A concern was raised through the trust's clinical governance channel. Anonymous, the system allows that, deliberately and correctly, about a consultant's conduct in relation to a historic review process. The wording alleged that a chair had used a review outcome to exert pressure on a junior colleague. I want you to see how good that is. is. It is not a lie about my clinical practice, which would have been checkable and would have collapsed. It is an allegation about process, an area where the evidence is confidential, where my own defense is the thing I am forbidden from saying out loud, and where the mere existence of the allegation requires an examination. You cannot ignore a governance concern. It doesn't work like that, and it shouldn't. So I went from being a woman who chairs those processes to a woman sitting inside one, and the difference between those two chairs is about 9 inches and everything. I want to describe the 6 weeks, because people imagine a suspension and a drama, and it was nothing like that. Nothing happened. That's what it's like. I kept working, I kept my clinics, my on-calls, my theater lists, my trauma rota. Nobody restricted anything, because there was nothing clinical to restrict. What happened is that I had a meeting in a diary called governance, informal, and then another one, and that I had to write an account of the 11-minute conversation, and then a supplementary account, and that at some point in October, a colleague I have worked with for 9 years stopped asking me to come for coffee. He didn't stop being friendly, he stopped being casual. There's a difference, and you can feel it at 40 paces. And the thing that did the actual damage in those 6 weeks was not the process. It was that I started editing myself. I stopped saying things in meetings. I would draft an email and then take out the sentence that had any edge on it. In a review in the October, a different case, nothing to do with any of this, I was chairing, and there was a point where I would normally have pushed back on a consultant's account, and I could feel the shape of the question in my mouth, and I did not ask it. I asked a softer one. It made no difference to that report, and I have checked twice, and I still think about it. That's what an unresolved allegation actually does. It doesn't stop you working. It gets into the room with you and makes you slightly less useful, quietly, in ways nobody will ever audit. The governance lead is a woman called Branach Iomher, and she is not a doctor, and she is one of the best people I have ever worked with, and she was scrupulously neutral for 6 weeks, and I have never resented anybody so much for doing their job properly. The meeting in November had 3 people in it: Brana, me, and Callan Vesey, because he had by then identified himself as the source, having been advised, correctly, that an anonymous concern of that specificity was going to be attributable anyway. He had a folder. He had been thorough. He had a timeline of our 11-minute meeting, contemporaneous notes he'd written afterward, and a written account of the dinner. And I sat and listened to a man describe, accurately, everything I had said to him, in order, and it was all true, and all of it sounded like exactly what he said it was. He was good, I have to say that. He was calm and he was measured, and he never once overstated anything, which is the tell of somebody who knows that overstating is what kills these. He said he had come to me privately and respectfully. True. He said I had declined to answer 3 times. True. He said that he had subsequently become aware, and he was careful with the wording, that I was a member of his fiancé's family, and that there had been an incident at a social occasion. True, and beautifully constructed, because it does not say I did anything at that occasion. It just puts the 2 things in the same paragraph. And then he said the sentence that the whole complaint actually rested on, and it is 9 words long. He said, I don't know what I'm supposed to have done, which is completely, literally, devastatingly true. He didn't know. That was the entire problem, and it had been the entire problem for 18 months, and it was, at that moment, still the problem. And the only person in the building who could fix it was sitting across the table from him being accused of not fixing it. Brona asked me for my account. Brona asked me for my account. And I sat there and understood with complete clarity that I had 2 options. I could defend myself, which would require me to characterize the review's findings in a room to a third party in order to demonstrate that I had not weaponized them, which is the precise act I was accused of, and which would, in performing my innocence, actually make me guilty. Or I could not. So I did the other thing. It took me about 40 seconds to decide, and I have never been more certain about anything. I said, Brona, I'm not going to give an account. She started to say something, and I said, I'd like to make a request instead. And then I asked formally on the record for the Ferreter M&M report to be released in full to Mr. Vesey, on the grounds that he was a named participant in the case, that he had never been debriefed on the outcome, and that in my view, my documented view at the time, in the minutes, that failure to debrief was itself a departmental failing. Brona Iomher looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, are you asking me to disclose a review report to a participant? And I said, I'm asking you to give a doctor the outcome of a process he was in 18 months ago. Yes. And then I stood up and picked up my bag and said, I'll leave you to it. He should read it on his own. And I went and sat in my car in the multi-story for about an hour. Brona rang me at 6:10 that evening, and I want to put down what she said, because it is the only piece of external validation I got in the entire 2 years, and I have played it back to myself more often than I would like to admit. She said, I want to check you understand what you just did. I said I did. And she said, you've just asked me to hand a man who has raised a formal concern against you the one document in this building that he could use to characterize your conduct however he likes, and you've left the room so he can read it without you in it. I said, yes. And she said, why? I said, because he spent 18 months thinking he killed somebody, and he didn't, and nobody ever told him. There was a pause on that phone call that went on long enough that I looked at the screen to check it was still connected. Then Branach Iomher said, right. And then she said, for what it's worth, and I shouldn't say this, and I'm going to, in 11 years, I've never had one of these where the person under it asked me to give the complainant more information. I said, is that good or bad? And she said, it's the first thing in 6 weeks that's told me anything. In the report is 11 pages. Finding the death death was not attributable to any individual clinical act or omission. In plain English, and it is nearly plain English in the document, nobody in that theater did anything wrong. The patient had an injury pattern that had a mortality rate attached to it before the doors opened. Callan Vessey's name appears 4 times, all 4 in the timeline, all 4 neutral. And then there are 3 recommendations. Recommendation 1 is about blood product availability. Recommendation 3 is about the trauma call criteria. Recommendation 2 is that the department cease rostering surgical registrars for consecutive night shifts beyond a defined limit, on the grounds that the second assistant in this case was at hour 31 of a rota pattern that the panel considered unsafe, and that this was a systemic and not an individual failure. I need to explain what that case actually was, briefly, because otherwise recommendation 2 is just a line in a document. A 24-year-old came off a motorcycle on a dual carriageway on a Sunday night. He arrived with a pelvic injury pattern that has a number attached to it in the literature, and the number is not good, and everybody in that resus bay knew the number within about 90 seconds of the doors opening. He went to theater. He died at 04:20. Callan Vessey was second assistant. He was at hour 31 of a pattern that had him on his 4th consecutive night. He did nothing wrong at any point that anybody could identify, and I read the whole timeline twice and there is nothing in it. But the panel had a decision to make about how to describe the fatigue, and there were 2 ways to write it. You can write it as a property of the individual. The second assistant had been on duty for 31 hours, which is true, and which lands in the file, and which sits under that man's name for the rest of his career, whether or not anybody ever says another word about it. Or you can write it as a property of the rota, which is where it actually lives. I argued for 4 hours for recommendation 2. I have the minutes. There were people in that room who did not want it, because it costs money, and it makes a rota harder to fill. And there is a version of that report where recommendation 2 does not exist, and where the second assistant's fatigue is instead noted as a contributing factor in his individual practice. That version was on the table. I sat in a room for 4 hours and made sure it wasn't the one that got written. For a registrar I had never met. And then 18 months later, his rota changed, and nobody told him why, and he assumed it was because somebody upstairs had decided he couldn't be trusted with nights. Every single thing that man did to me for 5 months, he did to bury a document that says he did nothing wrong and that somebody protected him. He withdrew the concern 11 days later. There was no apology, and I did not expect one, and I want to be honest and say I would have thought less of him if there had been, because an apology is an admission, and he is not stupid, and he has a career. What there was, 11 days after that, was an email to my work address at 2340 on a Sunday. 2 lines, no greeting. I've read it. Thank you for recommendation 2. I have never replied to it, and I have never deleted it. I have thought a great deal about what is and isn't in those 2 lines. There's no apology. There's no acknowledgement of 5 months, of my mother, of the governance file with my name on it that will exist for as long as that trust keeps records. But there's recommendation 2 House, specifically by number, which means he read all 11 pages, and he understood what it meant, and he understood that somebody had to have argued for it, and he did the arithmetic about who. And there's the timestamp. 20 to midnight on a Sunday. I've been a doctor for 21 years. I know what a Sunday night at 20 to midnight is. It's the night before a Monday list. It is not when a careful man sends a difficult email. It's when he stops being able not to. I think he read it that evening, alone, having asked Brona for it or having had it sent, and I think he sat with it for a few hours. And I think that at some point he understood that the woman who had refused to tell him anything for 11 minutes in an office was the same woman who had spent 4 hours in a room 18 months earlier making sure his name was not the answer to anything. And then he sent 9 words instead of an apology, because an apology would have been an admission. And he has a wedding in April and a career and a life. I would probably have done the same. I would like to say otherwise. They got married in the April. I was not invited, which was correct and which I would have declined. My mother went. My Aunt Meredith went and sent me a photograph of the cake with a message saying she wished I could have been there and that everybody had asked after me. The family account has never been corrected, and it is not going to be. In my family's version of the last 2 years, I turned up to Delphine's engagement in scrubs, made it weird, upset her, and then had some kind of difficult period at work that nobody talks about directly. That's it. That's what happened, as far as 40-odd people I'm related to are concerned. I could correct it, even now. I could sit my mother down and explain a closed process and a governance concern and recommendation too. I've decided not to, and the reason is not nobility. It's that the correction requires me to hand my mother a version of events in which a doctor she likes tried to end her daughter's career, and she would believe me, and she would carry it, and she is 74. The account that exists costs me a lot, and costs her nothing. The true one is the other way round. There's one more reason, and it's less noble. If I correct it, I have to go through my family one at a time. My mother, Meredith, Ridwin, the rest. And each of those conversations requires them to accept that they participated, that they rang me, that they said the thing about burnout, that they were the delivery mechanism. Not one of them did anything wrong. Every single one of them was being kind with the information they had. But you cannot explain this to somebody without them working out, about 2/3 of the way through, what they personally did. And then they have to sit with it, and then they have to decide how they feel about me knowing. 6 people would carry that, so that I could feel accurately understood by 6 people. That's not a trait I want. I have sat in enough relatives' rooms to know that there is a category of true information that helps nobody, and that that the hardest professional skill I have is knowing which category a thing is in. My family think I'm cold and had a difficult couple of years. I can live inside that. It's not even that far off. The ROTA limit is trust policy now. It went to the network in the second year and 3 sites run it. I don't know how many registrars are on it. Several hundred probably at this point. None of them know it exists, and none of them know why. And that is exactly how it is supposed to work. And I would not change one thing about that. Somebody asked me last year, a trainee, not knowing what she was asking, whether the M&M process is worth it, given nobody outside the room ever sees what it does. I said yes. She said, how do you know? And I said, because I've had one of them cost me something and I'd still write the same report. She looked slightly baffled, and then somebody called her for a chest drain, and that was the end of it. And I don't suppose she thought about it again. I go to the family things, fewer than I used to, and I leave early, and I have a glass of water because I'm usually back on at 6. Somebody generally asks whether I've had a busy one, and I say, yeah, busy.